The gunshot shattered the night like lightning in a summer storm. The sheriff suddenly sat upright in his bed, soaked in sweat and panting deeply. For a brief moment he was back in the field hospital, his hands covered in blood, the screams of dying soldiers ringing in his ears. Then I was reminded of the reality within the creaking wooden walls of my Wyoming cabin, the silver moonlight spilling over the floorboards, and the distant howling of a coyote. It was July 1873, 5 years since the war had concluded. 5 years since he had buried his medical bag, along with his last remaining faith. A different sound cut through the darkness, not from his nightmares this time. An actual noise, movement outside. My hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle, leaning against my nightstand. The wood felt cool against my calloused palm as I silently rose on my bare feet. I didn't light a lantern. 8 years of war had taught me to navigate darkness as if it were an old friend. The porch floorboards beneath my weight creaked softly. The night air carried the scent of pine and earth. The vast Wyoming territory stretched endlessly before me. Rolling hills faded into shadows, interrupted only by the silhouette of the abandoned chapel on the ridge. The full moon hung vigilantly overhead, casting long shadows across my property. Then he saw them. A woman with wild hair in the moonlight, dragging a small child by the hand, both frantic in their movement, through the tall grass beyond his fence. Behind them, the sound of hounds echoed across the plains. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He had left civilization behind to avoid situations like this. Yet something in the woman's desperate actions stirred a long-buried feeling inside me, something I thought was gone forever. The danger drew nearer. Without hesitation, Jedediah raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack resounded across the valley like thunder. "Here!" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The woman's head snapped toward him. Even in the darkness, he saw the fear in her eyes, not of him, but of whatever was behind her. She veered course, half dragging the child toward her porch. As they neared, I could see the bloodstains on her dress and the exhaustion in her staggering gait. "Please," she gasped as she reached the bottom of my porch steps. "They'll kill us." The girl beside me, no older than 7, stood silent with wide, unblinking eyes glimmering in the moonlight. She clutched a worn rag doll tightly across her chest, her knuckles white. I hesitated briefly before stepping aside, nodding sharply to invite them inside. As they passed, the scent of fear and blood filled my nostrils. Familiar territory. "Who's after you?" he asked, peering into the darkness beyond his property. The woman offered no reply, collapsing against his kitchen table, her breathing labored. The child stayed silent, observing Jedediah with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "It doesn't matter," Jedediah muttered, more to himself than to them. He shut the door, sliding the heavy bolt into place. "You can stay until morning? Then you'll be on your way." The woman nodded weakly, clutching the child's hand as if afraid she might vanish. Jedediah lit a lamp, its golden glow revealing the strangers properly for the first time. The woman appeared younger than I initially thought, perhaps in her mid-30s, with dark hair that could have been beautiful if not matted with sweat and dirt. Her face was a canvas of bruises in various stages of healing, and her lips bore a deep gash along her hairline. But it was her eyes that held me, filled with a mix of fear and a stubborn resolve that reminded me of soldiers who refused to die despite their wounds. "You're bleeding," he said flatly, nodding toward her shoulder where her dress was torn and streaked with blood. "It's nothing," she whispered. But her pulse told another story. I hesitated. having not tended wounds since the war, something I hadn't wanted to do. But the woman was swaying on her feet, and whatever was hunting us wouldn't be easily deterred by a warning shot alone. "Sit down," he ordered, pulling out a chair. "And you," he added to the girl. "There's water in that bucket. Bring it here." To his surprise, the girl immediately obeyed, dragging the heavy wooden bucket across the floor without a word. Her movements were practiced, as if caring for injured adults was routine for her. "I need to check that wound," Jedediah told the woman. "It needs to be cleaned." She nodded, wincing as she tried to remove her shawl. He stepped forward to assist her, noticing how she flinched at his touch. He moved slowly and gently, just as he used to handle wounded horses on his family's farm long ago. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to distract her during the examination. "Violet," she answered after a moment of hesitation. "Violet Harper. This is my daughter, Lila." Jedediah looked at the girl who had not spoken and was small for her age, with dark hair and a serious expression. She watched him very intently. "Gunslinger Jedediah Smith," he replied, shifting his focus back to her shoulder. "That was a deep cut, likely from a knife, but it's clean. It needs stitches." As I cleaned the wound, I noticed something beneath the torn fabric, a small tattoo on her upper arm, a crossed, inverted symbol surrounded by strange markings. I frowned but stayed silent, concentrating on my task. "This will hurt," he warned as he threaded a needle. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd fled from medicine was now performing emergency surgery in his own kitchen by lamplight. Rachel didn't cry out when the needle pierced her flesh. She sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the wall, her knuckles whitening as she endured the pain. Lila stood close to her mother, her tiny hand resting on Rachel's arm, offering silent comfort. "You've got steady hands," Rachel said quietly, her voice tight. Like a doctor, Jedediah's movements faltered for a brief moment. "I was once," he admitted, "during the war." He didn't elaborate. The less they knew about him, the better. Morning would come, and they would leave, taking their troubles with them. That was the plan. When he finished, Jedediah wrapped her shoulder in a clean piece of cloth torn from an old shirt. "It'll hold," he said, stepping back. "You need rest." Rachel's eyes darted toward the door, then back to me. "We can't stay," she whispered, exhaustion evident in her tone. "They'll come. They always do." "Who?" I asked, trying to keep my patience. "Who's after you?" Rachel hesitated, glancing at her daughter. Rebecca had finally sat down, exhausted but alert, her small body slumped yet watchful. "My father-in-law and his congregation," Rachel finally managed in a soft voice. The way she said those words made my skin crawl. I'd heard that tone before. Men describing battlefields, too gruesome for words. "We just need a safe place for tonight," I continued. "By morning, we'll be gone." Jedediah should have refused, should have ordered us to leave at first light. But instead, he nodded toward the small bedroom off the kitchen, my mother's room untouched since she passed away years ago. "You can sleep there. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer." Relief washed over Lisa's face, the only real emotion he'd seen beyond fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "We won't cause trouble." Jedediah already felt regret creeping in as he watched her gather her exhausted daughter. He went back to the porch, even though Ethan had never entered the abandoned church on the ridge, despite owning this land for the past 3 years. Some scars were too deep for even the passage of time to heal. He touched the brass key hanging from the leather cord around his neck, a personal reminder of sins that could never be made right. By the time dawn tinted the eastern sky with shades of gold and crimson, I convinced myself that the threat was over. I believed the woman and her daughter would depart, and my life would settle into its quiet, solitary rhythm. I had a simple life of hard labor and sleep devoid of dreams, but I was mistaken. I awoke in unfamiliar surroundings, my body stiff with fear until my memory pieced itself together. The farmhouse, the quiet man with haunted eyes and gentle hands. Safety, at least for now. Lila lay asleep beside her small chest, rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of childhood. Rachel brushed a dark strand of hair from her daughter's brow, her heart heavy with love and dread in equal measure. How long could I keep running? How far would be enough? The aroma of strong coffee drifted through the crack beneath the door. I carefully moved from the bed, grimacing as my freshly stitched wound pulled at me. Her reflection in the little mirror above the wash basin was barely recognizable. Hollow-eyed, bruised, her hair matted with sweat and dirt. I looked like a frantic creature hunted and desperate. Yet beneath her fear and exhaustion burned a fierce resolve. They had to survive. They had no choice. I splashed water on my face and tried to smooth my hair as best I could. The dress I wore was beyond repair, torn, blood-stained, soaked with sweat and terror. I would have to ask our reluctant host for something to wear, another kindness I owed in my growing debt. Lila shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering open. For an instant, confusion shaded her face. Then recognition dawned along with a weariness that had become ingrained in her at age 7. "It's all right," Lila said softly, soothing her daughter with a gentle touch. "We're safe for now." Lila made no reply, only nodded quietly. She hadn't spoken much since they took flight 3 days ago. I tried not to worry that my young daughter had seen things no one, especially not a child, should witness. Silence was my shield, my way of making sense of this upside-down world. Together, we moved into the main room of the farmhouse. Gunslinger Jedediah Smith stood at the iron stove with his back to them, his shoulders tense beneath a worn cotton shirt. He turned at their entrance, his face an unreadable mask. "There's coffee," he greeted simply as he poured. Lila nodded gratefully, guiding me to the rough-hewn table. The scene's quiet domesticity, the man at the stove, the morning light filtering through the windows, the fragrance of coffee and wood smoke, brought a sudden, unexpected emotion to my throat. When had I last known such ordinary peace? "Your shoulder?" Ethan asked, setting mugs before us. "It's better," Rachel responded softly. "Thank you," she added. Her gestures vague but encompassing. Not just the medical help, but their entire shelter, their very lives. Ethan's nod was brief. He poured coffee for her, but only milk for Lila, a gesture that surprised Rachel. Most men wouldn't have considered a child's needs so thoughtfully. "You said you'd be gone by morning," he reminded her, his tone gentler than it was the night before. Rachel's hands clenched around the warm mug. "Yes, we just needed the money they didn't have. A destination we hadn't chosen. A miracle. They'd be watching the road," she said instead. "My father-in-law has influence." A flicker of recognition, or suspicion, appeared in Ethan's eyes. "This father-in-law, what's his name?" Rachel hesitated, glancing at Lila, who was quietly tearing her bread into tiny pieces, arranging them in patterns only she understood. "Reverend Malachi Graves," she finally said. "He's the leader of a church called the Path of Salvation." My face remained impassive, but my knuckles whitened around the mug. "Religious folks," I said flatly with disapproval. Rachel corrected softly. "It's not just religion. It's a cult. They believe the end times are near, and only the purified will survive. The belief also includes that Lila is... She hesitated to say it aloud before her daughter. But Lila looked up, her small face solemn and serious. She reached into her tattered dress pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table to Oliver. He unfolded it slowly, his expression shifting as he observed the child's crude drawing. Dark-robed figures, flames, a building topped with a cross, centered on a small figure, with dark hair surrounded by what looked like light. She draws what she sees, she explained softly. Sometimes before it happens. My gaze met hers, skepticism battling with something else, perhaps recognition. I carefully refolded the drawing, pondering. So you believe she's what? A prophet? The chosen one, Rachel whispered. Born to lead her flock through darkness, to be their vessel. Ethan's jaw tightened. And you ran. It wasn't a question, but Rachel answered regardless. After my husband died during a purification ritual, Jeremiah said it was time for Rebecca to fulfill her purpose. She couldn't finish her sentence. She didn't need to. The look in Ethan's eyes told her he understood enough. I see. He rose abruptly, carrying his mug to the window. For a long moment I watched him stare at the rolling hills and the distant silhouette of the church against the morning sky. When he turned back, his face was firm, if reluctant. You can stay, he said. 2 days, no more? Enough for your shoulder to heal and for you to decide your next move, he added. Relief flooded through me as if it were a tangible force. Thank you, I breathed. I won't be a burden. Ethan's mouth curled into what might have been a smile, on another man nonetheless. Everyone's a burden, Mrs. Keller. It's just a matter of how much weight you're willing to carry. With that cryptic statement, he grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. I've got fences to mend. East pasture. Stay inside. If anyone comes, use this. He placed a small revolver on the table, gleaming faintly in the morning light. Rebecca stared at the weapon, her face unreadable. Rachel fought the instinct to push it away, to shield her daughter from yet another symbol of violence. Instead, she nodded quietly in understanding. Ethan paused at the door. There are clothes in the chest in the room upstairs, my mother's. They might fit. Then he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Rachel exhaled slowly, only now realizing she'd been holding her breath. 2 days, just a brief reprieve, no more. But it was more than she dared hope for. Come, she told Lila, forcing brightness into her voice. Let's get cleaned up. We're safe here. Lila said nothing, her attention fixed on the drawing Ethan had left on the table. With deliberate movements, she added a figure outside the burning building, watching a man with something like a key around his neck. The fence post had weathered another winter in the frontier, but just barely. I drove the stakes into the rocky ground with more force than necessary, each hit sending vibrations up through my arms. Physical labor has been my salvation these past years, exhausting my body to quiet my mind. But today my thoughts refused to quiet. They circled like vultures around the wounded woman and her silent child, whose eyes were too old for her age. The path of salvation. The very name made my skin crawl. He paused, wiping sweat from my brow despite the early hour. I glanced back at my lonely farmhouse, standing solitary in the vast emptiness of Wyoming. From this distance, it appeared tranquil, smoke curling from the chimney as the morning light shimmered on the windows, hiding the chaos that had come to my doorstep in the night. His hand instinctively reached for the brass key hanging around his neck, a reminder of wounds that would never truly heal, as my mother used to say. Some injuries never mend because you keep them exposed and open, she had explained. Some wounds are meant to be tended and cultivated like delicate gardens. I had been tending mine for 8 long years. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warmth as I moved along the fence line. By noon, I had reached the eastern edge of my land, where the terrain inclined upward toward the ridge. At its peak, the abandoned church stood as a silent guardian, its dark, windowless openings resembling empty eye sockets. Ethan had never stepped inside, although curiosity had occasionally beckoned him over the years. The previous owner had only briefly mentioned it, saying it was built by some forgotten sect, abandoned during a severe winter when many of the followers had fallen ill with fever. It resembled countless other houses of worship Ethan had seen, places of death and despair. Out of the corner of his eye, something moved, a flash of color against the church's weathered gray facade. I tensed, reaching for my knife at my belt, but it was merely a piece of torn fabric caught on a nail fluttering in the breeze, a vivid red against the faded wood. I frowned, noting that it hadn't been there yesterday. After only a moment's hesitation, I began to climb the hill toward the church. The grass was worn and bent in places, showing recent footfalls, human, not animal, and fresh tracks. The doors, rusted on their hinges, hung crookedly, and the cross that once crowned them had long rotted away. Moving cautiously, I approached, my years of combat experience rendering my movements silent despite my size. Peering through the crack between the doors, I saw that the interior was dim, dust motes dancing in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced the broken roof. Rows of pews stretched toward a simple altar, most still standing despite years of neglect. The air thickened with the scent of dust and decay, but beneath it there was something else, candle wax, and beneath that, the metallic sharpness of blood. He pushed the doors further open, stepping inside quietly. The floorboards creaked beneath my cautious steps. I advanced slowly down the central aisle, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. On the altar, hardened pools of wax indicated recent candles had been burned, and darker stains, possibly blood, had yet to dry. Scratched into the wooden surface was a symbol and an inverted cross circled by arcane markings, eerily similar to the symbol seen on Violet Harper's shoulder. They'd been here recently, waiting quietly and watching, preparing for something. A soft sound broke the silence, the unmistakable creak of a footstep on aged wood. I spun around with my knife drawn, eyes scanning. A figure stood in the shadows at the back of the church, tall, wearing a long coat despite the summer heat. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then the figure turned abruptly and fled, slipping through a side door before I could give chase. By the time I reached the doorway, the hillside was deserted. Only the swaying grass hinted at anyone's passing. He froze in the doorway, heart pounding, clutching his knife tightly. They had been here already, watching, waiting, and I knew they could return at any moment. I needed to get back to the farmhouse immediately. Meanwhile, I was busy repairing fences under the Wyoming sun, while Rachel examined the small farmhouse that had become our temporary refuge. The dwelling told a story of its owner's austere, yet well-maintained lifestyle, more a soldier's quarters than a home. Few personal keepsakes decorated the space. No photographs on the walls, no mementos on the mantel, only a shelf lined with medical books and a few worn novels, hinting at the owner's past life. Lila quietly followed her mother from room to room, clutching her rag doll like a protective charm. The child's silence was heavy, more so than ever since their flight, causing her mother to worry about what horrors lurked behind those solemn eyes. What memories haunted her nights? In the bedroom where they had slept, she found the chest Ethan had spoken of. Inside, there were plain calico dresses, woolen shawls, and some faded white blouses, all neatly folded as if waiting patiently for their owner's return. My mother's clothes, Rachel thought softly, running her fingers over the fabric. Given Ethan's solitary life, it was likely no one lived there anymore. I chose a dress that seemed to fit me reasonably well, and a smaller one that might work for Lila with some adjustments. As I closed the chest, something caught my eye. A small wooden box tucked beneath the bed. Curiosity compelled me to kneel, wincing at my injured shoulder. The box was a miniature trunk, reinforced and dusty, locked tight with no apparent key, but I restrained myself from attempting to open it, remembering Ethan's hesitant kindness. "Come, Lila," I urged softly. "Let's get cleaned up." I washed with water heated on the stove. The simple act of cleaning myself restored a faint sense of normalcy. Lila's mother gently worked out the tangles in her hair, humming softly, something she'd done since the girl was an infant. For a moment, I felt almost back in my old life, perhaps in Pennsylvania, before my husband's fall into his father's influence, before the path had taken over everything. Rachel put on the borrowed dress, which was loose at the waist but clean and whole, an improvement over the rags they'd arrived in. "There," she said, twisting her damp hair into a simple knot. "Much better, don't you think?" Lila's response was a faint nod, an almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough to lift Rachel's spirits. The day stretched long before us, filled with small, ordinary tasks: washing, tidying, organizing the sparse supplies as a distraction from our constant fear. They knew they were still being hunted. A 2-day reprieve was not enough to forget that. Lila sat at the kitchen table with a scrap of paper Ethan had left, blank ledger sheets and a stub of a pencil, drawing with intense focus. Her small hands traced image after image, dark figures with outstretched arms, flames licking at wooden walls, one small figure surrounded by light at the center. I watched her, heart heavy with grief and dread. Lila's drawings had begun shortly after her 7th birthday. Childish sketches at first, but they grew more detailed and eerily accurate over time. Reverend Malachi Graves had called it a divine gift, proof of her being chosen. Rachel perceived it differently, an attempt by a child's mind to make sense of the horror that surrounded her, the only way she could manage. Eventually, her child's drawings started predicting events: a bird striking a window, an unexpected visitor, and larger tragedies like Miles's sudden illness or the fire in the gathering hall. By then, Jeremiah had fully taken control, isolating Lila to prepare her for her role, with Rachel only limited contact, until she overheard the elders planning the final purification ritual, which would free Lila's spirit but also cost Miles his life when he questioned his father's teachings. That very night, I fled, taking only the clothes on my back and the little money I had hidden away. A desperate 3-day journey of escape brought me to this remote farmhouse and its enigmatic owner. A temporary respite, nothing more. Rachel finally allowed herself to breathe and think beyond the immediate danger for the first time since their escape. Where could they possibly go? Who would believe the story I needed to tell? And even if someone did, who could stand up to Reverend Malachi Graves with his wealth and influence, his devoted followers convinced he was God's voice? I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't notice the door opening. When my shadow cast across the floor, I started, my hand instinctively reaching for the revolver still lying on the table. "Don't," I said, raising a hand gently. My face looked grim, eyes shadowed with fresh worry. We need to have a talk. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. They found us. It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, glancing at Lila, who had looked up from her drawing. Her pencil paused mid-stroke. Not inside the house, he explained from the porch. Rachel hesitated, reluctant to leave Lila alone. She'll be safe for a few minutes, Ethan assured her softly. We'll be right outside the door. After a moment, Rachel nodded and knelt beside Lila, gently brushing her daughter's cheek. Stay here, sweetheart. Draw me another picture. I'll be right outside with Mr. Blackwood. Rebecca's eyes, so clear and penetrating like Daniel's, lingered on her for a long moment. Then she nodded and returned to her drawing with intense focus. Outside, the day had warmed significantly, and the scent of sun-baked earth and pine filled the air. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the beauty of the vast landscape, the rolling hills stretching towards distant mountains, the endless blue sky overhead. But now I saw only exposure, nowhere to hide, and danger lurking in every shadow. We're at the church, Ethan said without preamble, leaning casually against the porch railing. Recently, signs of some kind of ritual had appeared, and I could tell someone was watching. They took off running when they saw me. My friend Rachel wrapped her arms around herself despite the heat of the sun. How many? She asked. Only one I saw. But there'll be others, I thought, as I scanned the horizon. My eyes missed nothing. That mark on your shoulder, the inverted cross, it was carved into the altar. Rachel's hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder, feeling the raised scar beneath her clothing. The mark of the chosen, she said bitterly. All the inner circle bears it, she added. I once believed in it, she admitted softly. Ethan asked, Did you believe? Not as a question, but as an observation. My husband believed, she answered. I loved him. It seemed a small price to pay for his happiness. Her voice hardened as she added, Until I realized the cost was my daughter's life. Ethan was silent for a long while, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke again, his voice was rougher. 2 days isn't enough. They're already watching and waiting. Then we should leave now, Rachel said, her voice trembling with dread. Where could we possibly go? How far before the path finds us again? No, Ethan said firmly, straightening. That's what they expect. They'll be watching all the roads, the train station in town. You stay here until we come up with a plan. Rachel looked at him, woven with hope and suspicion. Why would you help us? You don't even know us. This isn't your fight. I reached for the brass key hanging around my neck, a gesture Rachel had noticed before, unconscious, as if checking that my heart still beat. Let's just say I've seen what I thought was the writing of Jeremiah Keller, and Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she began to read. As she processed the words, a chilling numbness settled in her stomach. This was no random coincidence. Why I had arrived at that particular farmhouse and met that specific man. The network of links stretched back years, even decades, woven with blood, faith, and terrible sacrifices. The true truth was waiting to be uncovered, and discovering it would change everything I knew. Outside, a distant rumble of thunder echoed, yet the sky stayed clear and calm. A storm was approaching, not just weather-wise, but in more ways than one. Rachel carefully folded the letter, tucked it into the trunk, and closed the lid, her hands trembling. When Ethan returned, she would be ready, and from that moment on, they would both speak honestly, whether they wanted to or not. Her daughter's future, possibly everyone's, depended on that honesty. The abandoned chapel on Iron Ridge stood against the afternoon sky, Its weathered wood faded to a dull silver in the harsh sunlight. I edged closer, my senses sharpened for any signs of watchers nearby. The hillside appeared empty, but I knew better than to trust the surface alone. Someone who had fled earlier might have returned, possibly watching him from a hidden vantage point. He tied his horse to a small pine tree some distance from the chapel, then approached on foot with seasoned caution, moving from cover to cover. The doors still hung crooked as I had left them, and the interior was dark and silent beyond. I hesitated at the threshold, memories flooding over me, unwelcome. How many churches of God had I entered during the war? How many makeshift hospitals and sanctuaries had seen blood pooling on sacred ground? Prayers and screams blending into the heavy smell of incense. How many men had he watched die beneath vaulted ceilings? Their last sight was not heaven's splendor, but the determined faces of surgeons bearing unbearable burdens. Shaking off these ghosts, I stepped inside the church. Inside, the pews still sat empty. The altar bore the disturbing symbol, and spots of hardened candle wax remained. But something about the place felt different, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made my hair stand on end. He moved slowly down the center aisle, eyes scanning for what had unsettled him. The altar looked untouched. The dark bloodstain on the weathered wood remained. White candles stood in a semicircle, unlit but still arranged as before. It was only when he reached the front pew that Ethan spotted a small object deliberately placed at its center. A child's toy, a tiny cloth doll with button eyes and yarn hair, identical to the one Lila carried. A plain and threatening message buzzed in my head. We know where you are. We know what you protect. My hand instinctively went to the key around my neck, a habitual gesture of reassurance. They might be aware of his location, maybe even suspect who I was sheltering, but they didn't know everything. Some secrets remained buried too deep. He carefully slipped the doll into his coat pocket, contemplating its importance, maybe even evidence, though he doubted the local constable would be interested in the worries of a strange woman and her peculiar child. The territory of Red Ridge had its own laws and justice, and outsiders with wild tales rarely gained sympathy from the rugged settlers and opportunists who populated these lands. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A loose floorboard near the altar, slightly raised as if recently disturbed. I knelt, fingers probing the worn wood until I found the edge. The door lifted effortlessly, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a leather-bound book, its cover plain except for a symbol carved into the leather, an eye surrounded by 7 stars, the same symbol from a letter I had received 10 years earlier. The letter that had changed everything. His hand hovered over the book hesitantly, reluctant to disturb it, yet unable to leave it undisturbed. Finally, I lifted it from its hiding place, the cool, smooth leather familiar, beneath my calloused fingers. The pages inside were filled with handwritten notes, the same flowing script I remembered from that old letter. Dates, names, places, records of rituals and ascensions, lists of the chosen and their preparations, a detailed account of souls claimed for the path of salvation. Near the end, Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the haunting entries. Miles Richmond ascended through purification, March 12th, 1873. Lila, the 7th chosen, preparation to begin on her 7th birthday, July 7th, 1873, Rachel Keller, vessel of the chosen, scheduled for cleansing through fire after her daughter's preparation. Today was July 3rd, just 4 days before Rebecca's scheduled ritual. Ethan closed the book, His mind made up. They would not wait, wouldn't hide, wouldn't run, because the path had already found them, had been watching and waiting, and it would keep hunting until it reclaimed what it believed was rightfully theirs, unless someone stopped it permanently. Tucking the book into his coat, I took one last look around the church. My eyes fell on the inverted cross carved into the altar, its lines deep and deliberate. With sudden, visceral revulsion, he drew his knife and cut through the symbol, carving a deep wound into the wood. Perhaps an insignificant gesture in the grand scheme, but it felt right, necessary, a statement of defiance, a line drawn in opposition to the darkness that had tainted this place. Stepping back into the bright afternoon, I experienced a strange sense of clarity and resolve. For 8 years I had concealed myself from the world, from my past, from the choices that haunted my dreams. He had believed himself beyond redemption, beyond purpose. Maybe he had been wrong. The ride back to the farmhouse felt shorter than before, the landscape sharper, colors more vivid beneath the wide blue sky. He felt a weight on his chest, not guilt or regret, but something new, responsibility, resolve. As the farmhouse came into view, I saw Rachel on the porch, her small figure tense against the weathered boards. Even from a distance, I sensed her alertness, her anticipation. She'd been waiting for me. I dismounted at the bottom of the steps, the book heavy inside my coat. The knowledge contained within would change everything for us. Demanding confessions I'd avoided for years, truths neither of us might be ready to face. "Did you find something?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but with a hint of unspoken dread beneath her words. Ethan nodded slowly as he climbed the steps. "Where's Lila?" "Sleeping. The drawings tire her out," he said, gesturing toward the door. "This isn't a place for open talk," he added softly. We sat at the kitchen table, the mysterious book between us like a living thing, dangerous, unpredictable. My face drained of color as I stared at the symbol on its cover. "Where did you find it?" she whispered. "Hidden under the church floorboards. Recently placed, I suppose." Ethan paused, studying her fearful face. "They left a doll, too, similar to Lila's," he said quietly. My hand flew to my mouth, eyes wide with terror. "They know we're here." "Yes," Ethan confirmed as he tapped the book. "And they have plans, specific plans for both of you." He turned to the page with Rebecca Keller's name, showing it to her. She inhaled sharply, her fingers white-knuckled against the table's edge. "July 7th, she whispered. "Her birthday." They always said 7 was the sacred number, the age of awakening. Her bright eyes filled with unshed tears as she looked at me. "What do we do? Where can we go that they won't find us?" I closed the book gently. There's nowhere far enough. Not while Reverend Malachi Graves breathes. The words hung heavily between us, full of warning and implication. I drew back, studying her with tired suspicion. "You knew him before we arrived," I said finally. "That's why you didn't turn us away." It wasn't what I had expected. I had anticipated fear, denial, maybe even outrage at my implied plan. Instead, I was met with this calm analysis, this acknowledgement of long-buried connections. "How did you find out?" he asked, intrigued despite himself. My laugh was devoid of humor. "I came across your letter, the one from Jeremiah, dated 1863. My hand moved reflexively to the key hanging around my neck, the familiar reassurance now observed and noted by those sharp eyes. "You went through my belongings." "Yes." She didn't apologize or look away. "My daughter's safety is at risk. I had to know who you truly were, what your connection to the path was. Ethan couldn't fault her reasoning, her maternal instinct to protect at any cost. He would have done the same in her place, perhaps even worse, in the name of safety. "So now you are aware," he said, his voice flat. "Oh, I knew Reverend Malachi Graves once, a lifetime ago." "Not everything," Rachel countered. "I know he wrote to you during the war. I know you've kept that letter all these years. I also know there was a Samuel who mattered to you." She paused. "But I don't understand why you're helping us now or what you stand to gain." Ethan remained silent for a long stretch. The burden of 8 years of silence pressed on me like a weight. When I finally spoke, my voice was rough from disuse, as if these words had been locked away so long they had rusted. "Samuel was my brother, my younger brother. He was sensitive, spiritual, as our mother called it. He perceived things differently, felt things more intensely." My brother's gaze drifted toward the window at the distant ridge where the church stood like a sentinel against the sky. "When the war erupted, I enlisted as a surgeon. Samuel wasn't cut out for battle, but he refused to stay behind. He followed me into the medical corps as a stretcher bearer." Rachel listened quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. "We were at Gettysburg," Ethan continued. "The slaughter, you can't imagine it. 3 days of hell on earth. Men torn apart by cannon fire. Boys younger than William bleeding out beneath my hands. And through it all, Samuel moved among them, not just tending wounds, but souls, praying with the dying, offering comfort. When medicine failed, his grip tightened around the brass key. After Gettysburg, Samuel changed. The suffering etched deeply into me. I began to question God's plan, searching for meaning amid the carnage. That's when I first encountered Reverend Malachi Graves. Rachel asked, surprised. "Reverend Malachi, it was time for the reckoning to arrive." Dawn blossomed over the rolling hills of Maplewood, streaks of pink and gold stretching across the sky as the stars faded into morning. I stood on the porch holding my coffee mug, warming my hands against the chilly air of the new day. I hadn't slept much, remaining vigil throughout the night, listening for hoofbeats, the pounding of hounds, or any sign that the ambush was about to unfold. But the night had gone by without incident, the darkness only broken by the occasional cry of a night bird or the distant howl of a coyote. I knew this was a false calm, the quiet before an unavoidable storm. Behind me, the door creaked open slowly. I stepped onto the porch, my borrowed dress hanging loosely on my frame, dark circles under my eyes showing I'd been just as restless as she had. "You should have woken me," she said softly. "I could have watched for a while." I shook my head. "Old habits. I've never been much for sleep." Rachel nodded in understanding, leaning against the porch railing beside me. For a long moment we stood silently, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in shifting shades. There was a comfort in this shared watch, this silent understanding between two people who had glimpsed the same darkness. "Lila's still sleeping," I finally said. "Her drawings always drain her. It's like whatever she sees takes something from her." I considered this, sipping my cooling coffee. "Has she always had these visions?" I asked, my voice quiet. "No. They began about a year ago. Dumal thought at first she'd sense a visitor before they arrived, or a storm before it broke." Rachel's voice grew tense. "Jeremiah called it a divine gift, proof she was chosen. I thought it was just intuition and sensitivity until her drawings began to reveal things that couldn't be mere coincidence." I supplied, "Like the church burning." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the ridge where the abandoned church stood silhouetted against the morning sky. She drew her deceased husband's death 3 days before it happened, exactly as it occurred. I gently added, I didn't understand what the drawing meant until it was too late. Yes. Her voice faltered, heavy with grief and guilt. I straightened myself, gathering strength. So what's our plan? We can't just wait for them to come. I had been contemplating that very question all through the long night. First, we need more details, their movements, their numbers, how far their influence spreads. I decided I should go into town, Rachel said, concern tightening her brow. Is that wise? I replied. If they're watching the farm, not the town, and they won't expect us to gather information instead of fleeing. I placed my empty mug on the porch railing. Besides, we need supplies if we're to fortify this place. Fortify, she echoed, the weight of the word sinking into her voice. You really think we can stand against them here? I looked her in the eye, my expression firm. I've been running for 8 years without taking a single stand. It's time to fight. After a moment, she nodded, resolve settling over her. I'll stay here with Lila, but be cautious in town. I headed to the barn to saddle my horse, already making a list of what we'd require: ammunition, kerosene, medical supplies, and non-perishable food. Jeremiah's influence goes farther than you realize. The journey to town would take most of the morning, leaving Lila and me alone at the farm. I hesitated, then returned to the house to retrieve the old army revolver from my bedside drawer. I was at the stove when I came back, heating water for tea or perhaps porridge. She turned around as I approached, eyebrows raised at the sight of the weapon in my hand. You already gave me a gun, she reminded me, nodding toward the smaller revolver still on the table from last night's talk. This one has more stopping power, I said, offering it by the grip. You know how to use it. She took the weapon with practiced ease, checking the cylinder confidently. Miles Richmond taught me before he changed, she said softly. I nodded, not surprised. Keep it close, I warned. I should be back by midday, I added, hesitant to say more. If I'm not, she prompted, there's a loose floorboard in the main bedroom under the bed. Cash enough to get you and Rebecca to Denver. I paused, then added, the box contains papers, evidence. Find Samuel Carter. He was a friend once. Her eyes widened at this plan, recognizing that I might not return, but she nodded, accepting the burden without objection. We'll be here, she said simply. As I rode toward the town, the morning sun warm on my back, I felt an unusual sense of peace. For 8 years, I had merely survived, haunted by failures, inaction, and grief. Now I had a purpose, as clear and sharp as a mountaineer's resolve. I would protect Lila, not for redemption, nor to ease my guilt, but because it was the right thing to do, because I knew someone had to stand against the darkness that the path symbolized. The town of Blackstone looked like a typical Wyoming settlement, with wooden buildings lining the main street. A general store, a saloon, a small church, some houses, and the sheriff's office, an unassuming place inhabited by hard-bitten farmers, miners passing through to more promising lands, and opportunists. I tethered my horse outside the general store, taking a moment to observe the quiet street. Few people were out at this hour, a woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the hat shop, 2 men loading crates onto a wagon, a dog lying in a patch of sunlight. Nothing suspicious, nothing indicating danger. Still, I had a feeling I was being watched, my instincts prickling at the back of my neck. I moved casually as I entered the shop. the bell above the door ringing cheerfully, a stark contrast to the tension tightening inside me. I looked up from my ledger, surprise plain on my weather-worn face. Doc Blackwood again in 1 month? Must be a record, I said with a faint grin. I managed a tight smile. My infrequent visits to town had become something of a joke over the years. Need supplies, Charles. Larger order than usual, I said smoothly. Expecting company out at that farm of yours? Charles's tone was light, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Just stocking up before winter, I replied, fabricating easily. It was July, but Harold wouldn't question prudence in this territory. Winters could be deadly if you weren't prepared. He gathered my list. Flour, coffee, salt, ammunition for the rifle and revolver, kerosene, medical supplies. Harold raised an eyebrow at the quantity, but stayed silent as he packed the items. I casually added, "We've got some visitors in town. Some religious folks asking questions." Harold paused, then lowered his voice. "They showed up 3 days ago, led by a preacher type, silver-haired and dressed like he's got money. Asking about a woman and child, they claim she's his daughter-in-law and granddaughter, run off after his son died." I kept my expression neutral. "What does the sheriff think of all this?" I inquired. Harold snorted soberly. "Grimes? I'd wager he's about as involved as the last deputy. Though one of their group spent a good part of yesterday at his office. That was worrying, if the law was compromised already." "Are they staying in town?" I asked, passing the money for my stay at the Gray Owl Inn. "Paying up front for a week." Harold wrapped the last of the packages. "Funny thing, only 2 of them sleep there. The others, no one's sure where they bed down." My unease deepened. They could be lurking anywhere, monitoring the roads or his farm, relaying information back to Jeremiah. I needed to get back to Rachel and Lila as quickly as possible. "Thanks, Harold," he said, collecting his items and loading them into his saddlebags. "Strange times we're living in," Harold commented, walking with him toward the door. "First, that church on your ridge has started showing signs of activity after all these years. Now, these strangers are coming around asking questions." I froze in place. "What do you mean the church is showing signs of activity?" Harold shrugged. "There's been lights up there at night the past few weeks. Smoke from the chimney sometimes. I figured maybe you were using it for storage or just for sunlight." "No," Ethan said sharply, his voice tense. "I never go near that place." Harold's face grew serious. "Well, someone does. Might be worth checking your property line, Doc. Could be squatters." Or even worse, Ethan thought grimly. Much worse. He was just about to leave when the door swung open, and Sheriff Elias Stanton stepped inside. I had not seen him in a while, and he had aged since the last time. More gray in his beard, extra weight around his middle, and the unmistakable flush across his cheeks from drinking too much. Still, his sharp eyes focused on me, narrowing slightly in recognition. "Blackwood," he acknowledged with a brief nod. "Unusual to see you in town." "Sheriff," Ethan replied with a neutral but cautious tone. "Just here for supplies." Grimes's gaze shifted to his saddlebag. 3, she repeated more assertively. "I can assist." Lila moved to her daughter, holding her close. "No, Lila. No, you're not part of this battle. Your task is to remain safe, to stay hidden when they arrive." "But I see things," Lila insisted, pulling back to look up at her mother. "I know things. Important things." Ethan approached cautiously, crouching down again to meet the child's gaze. "What things, Lila? What do you see?" Lila hesitated, glancing at her mother as if asking for permission. At Rachel's hesitant nod, she pressed on. "The man with the star," she said. The sheriff, he's not what he appears to be. I frowned. Grimes, what about him? He wears two faces, one for the path, one for himself. Lila's voice took on an odd rhythm, almost like memorized lines. He will help, but not in the way you expect. And Jeremiah, Rachel prompted softly. Do you see him too? Lila nodded, her small face serious. She's afraid of me, of what I know. She turned to Ethan, her next words chilling with their straightforwardness. He's afraid of you too because you know his secret. What secret? Ethan asked, though Rachel suspected he already understood. About the fire? About Samuel? Lila's eyes seemed older suddenly, knowing beyond her years. About how he didn't die as everyone thinks. The room fell silent except for the ticking clock on the mantel and the distant call of a meadowlark outside the window. Ethan had gone pale, his hands clenched at his sides as if to keep them from trembling. What do you mean? He asked, his voice just above a whisper. William died in the fire. 12 people died. Rebecca shook her head slowly. Not 12. 11. He escaped, changed, became someone else. Rachel watched realization dawn on Ethan's face, followed by a complex mix of hope, disbelief, anger, and fear. Samuel, he breathed. William became Samuel. Lila nodded, satisfied that he'd understood the truth she'd tried to convey. Then suddenly she yawned, the adult-like knowledge fading from her face, leaving only a tired child behind. I'm sleepy, Mama, she said, leaning against Rachel's skirts. Lila pulled her close, her mind overwhelmed by the implications of her mother's revelation. Of course, sweetheart. Let's get you settled for a nap. As she led Lila to the bedroom, her thoughts spun. If William hadn't died in the fire, if he had become Gabriel, Jeremiah's most trusted disciple, what would that mean for their current danger? Was he an enemy or a potential ally? And how did Lila know this, when even Samuel Carter's brother had believed him dead for 8 years? When she returned to the main room, Lila was at the window staring toward the ridge where the church stood, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. His posture was stiff, and he was once again clutching the brass key around his neck, an unconscious gesture of reassurance I had noticed before. Do you think it's true? I asked quietly, not wanting to startle him. About William? Ethan didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed at her question. I don't know. It seems impossible. I identified what was left of his body myself, buried him on the hillside behind the church. But if it's true, then everything changes, and nothing at all. I ran a hand through my hair, a rare sign of uncertainty from my usually stoic expression. Samuel, the Samuel I knew, died long before that fire. The path took me apart piece by piece, belief by belief, until my brother was gone. Gunslinger Jedediah Smith quickly approached the porch's edge, shading his eyes to scan the distant structure. I don't notice anything inside, Violet insisted. They're lighting candles. Many candles. As if to confirm her statement, a soft glow appeared through one of the broken windows of the abandoned chapel on Iron Ridge. Too steady for sunlight, too warm for fading daylight. Candlelight flickered exactly as I had described. How many are there? I asked, my voice strained with renewed tension. I closed my eyes briefly, as if seeking some inner vision. 7. No, 8. The silver figure is there. And the one with 2 faces, Reverend Malachi. Elijah's surprise was evident. The sheriff was at the chapel. Violet nodded. He arrived after the others, hiding nearby and listening in. Violet and Elijah exchanged glances, reconsidering their understanding of the situation. If Reverend Malachi was at the chapel spying on Jeremiah and his followers, It confirmed his claim of working against the cult, but it also meant he was in immediate danger if discovered, and might not be an ally when they needed him most. "And Samuel?" Elijah asked hesitantly, the name catching in his throat. "Is he there, Gabriel?" Violet's face clouded with confusion. "I can't see clearly. There's someone in the shadows, watching, waiting." I pressed my tiny hands to my temples, grimacing. "It hurts to look at him." Violet moved closer to her daughter, clutching her tightly. "That's enough, Violet. You don't need to see any more." But Violet wasn't finished. She looked up at me, her expression suddenly urgent. "They're not waiting until midnight. They're coming sooner. When it's dark, but before the moon rises." "How soon?" I demanded, already adjusting our timeline. 2 hours, Violet said with unsettling certainty. "Maybe 3. I nodded grimly. "Then we must accelerate our plans." "Violet, prepare Rebecca. Warm clothes, sturdy shoes. We might have to move quickly." As Violet guided Rebecca back inside, Elijah remained on the porch, his eyes fixed on the distant chapel. The faint glow from the windows had grown stronger, now multiple points of light visible through the broken glass. 8 people, Violet had said, including Jeremiah, possibly the brother he believed dead for 8 long years. His hand moved to the brass key around his neck, a talisman of past failures and future salvation. Tonight would end it, one way or another. The waiting, the hiding, the grief unresolved, all would be settled before dawn over Wyoming's hills. I sent up a silent prayer, not to God who had abandoned me on blood-soaked fields, but to whatever force might govern justice in this harsh world. Not for victory, not even for survival, but for the strength to face whatever is coming with courage and a clear purpose. Then I turned and went inside with Violet, shutting the door on the waning daylight, on the peaceful landscape that soon would turn into a battleground. The time for preparing was over. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The sun sank behind the western horizon, a crimson and gold blaze, as if the sky itself anticipated the violence ahead. Darkness seeped across the land, shadows stretching long and deep until the farm was isolated in a sea of night. The only light was a faint glow from the carefully shuttered windows. Inside, I moved from position to position, checking weapons, sight lines, and escape routes. Years of combat experience guided his preparations, redundancies layered upon redundancies, contingencies for every scenario he could imagine. Yet beneath his careful exterior, doubt gnawed at him. They were outnumbered, possibly surrounded. If Jeremiah brought his full force, Violet appeared in the main bedroom doorway, her expression steady despite the fear he knew she felt. She'd changed into practical clothing, pants under a short skirt, a work shirt with rolled-up sleeves, sturdy boots. Her hair was braided and pinned tightly to her head, leaving no loose strands for an attacker to grab. At her waist, the revolver he'd given her hung in an improvised holster, made from an old belt. "Lila's ready," she whispered. "I've explained what might happen, and what she must do if we're separated." Elijah nodded, once again impressed by her practical courage. "And you? Are you prepared?" Violet's smile was thin but genuine. "I've been preparing since the night I took Rebecca and fled. I won't let them take her, not while I'm alive." "They won't get that chance," Elijah assured. He hesitated, then added, "If something happens to me." "It won't," Violet interrupted, unwilling to entertain that thought. "If it does," I continued firmly, "get to the barn. There's a false wall behind the saddle rack in the tack room, just enough space for both of us to hide until it's safe to run. Violet nodded silently. "And if I don't make it, you'll get Lila to Cheyenne, to safety. I swear it." The promise felt natural, as if he'd been waiting all his life to say it. A faint sound from the hallway drew my attention. I saw Violet standing silently, a shadowy figure clutching her rag doll to her chest. Yet her eyes held wisdom far beyond her years. "They're leaving the church," she said simply. As Elijah and Violet approached, they exchanged glances. It was happening. "How many?" Elijah asked, kneeling to Violet's level. "6. The others stayed behind." Violet's gaze grew distant, unfocused. "The silver man leads them." "They carry fire torches," Violet suggested, voice rising with alarm. Violet shook her head. "Bottles. Fire inside bottles. Molotovs." Elijah's jaw clenched. "They plan to burn them out, just like they did 8 years ago, just like Violet had seen in her visions." "Change of plans," he said grimly. "We can't defend the barn against fire effectively. We need to meet them before they're close enough to use those weapons." Out in the open, Violet protested. "We'd be vulnerable." "Not if we choose the ground carefully," Elijah replied, considering his tactical options. "The barn, with its stone foundation, thick walls and limited entry points, offers better defense, and the hayloft provides high ground, with clear sightlines." I hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "It makes sense. But if they surround us, we'll be trapped." "Not necessarily." Elijah moved to the kitchen table, drawing a rough map on one of Violet's sketches. "There's a trap door in the loft that leads to a root cellar I dug, about 50 yards out near the creek. It was meant as a storm shelter, but it could serve as an escape route if needed." Violet studied the map, memorizing every detail. "How long do we have?" I asked, glancing at Violet, and her silent, attentive daughter, absorbing every word. "How close are they, Violet? Can you tell?" Violet closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with that uncanny certainty. The edge of the trees near the large rock stood quiet. 20 minutes, I estimated. Maybe less. "We need to move immediately." We gathered only the essentials, our weapons, ammunition, some medical supplies, and a lantern. Violet wrapped herself in a dark shawl, blending with the night to make herself less visible. Elijah doused all the house's lights, plunging the place into darkness and buying us a few extra minutes of confusion. Then, silently, they slipped out the back door, crossing the yard toward the barn. The structure was solid, built to withstand Wyoming winters, stone foundation, thick wooden walls, and a loft offering concealment and vantage. I had strengthened the defenses even further after acquiring the property, unconsciously preparing for a siege I had always sensed was inevitable. We worked tirelessly by the glow of a single covered lantern, urgency evident in every movement. I positioned Rachel behind the hayloft with the rifle, leveraging its range and precision to serve as our primary line of defense. He would take the ground floor armed with his revolver and combat knife, staying hidden in the shadows of the interior. Lila would remain concealed in the designated space beneath the floorboards, accessible through the trap door, yet out of immediate danger. As they wrapped up their preparations, an unnatural quiet settled over the night. No cricket song, no nightbird calls, not even the wind stirred. Everything seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. They were approaching. I ascended to the hayloft for a final strategic meeting with Rachel. She knelt near the narrow gap in the boards, her face set with resolve. "Remember," he whispered, "aim for the center of mass. Avoid fancy shots. And if they breach the barn, don't hesitate. Shoot to kill." Rachel nodded, never taking her eyes from the narrow slit in the darkness outside her position. "I won't hesitate." Not while Rebecca's life depends on it. Ethan touched her shoulder briefly, offering a quiet reassurance of their shared purpose. Then he turned toward Lila, who sat quietly beside her mother, with her rag doll clutched tightly. "It's time to go." Rachel appeared at his shoulder, her breath catching as she examined the open journal. "These are dates," she whispered, pointing to a column of figures along the edge of the page. "Records of ascensions, deaths, and sacrifices. Each one signifies someone who died during their rituals." I nodded with a grim expression. This was the proof I needed. Solid evidence of Jeremiah's past crimes and his murderous rituals. If only they could send this journal to Cheyenne for the federal authorities. A noise from the main sanctuary interrupted my thoughts. An opening and closing door followed by raised voices. One voice was deep and commanding, but not Jeremiah's. It belonged to someone of similar stature within the cult, and the other voice. My heart skipped a beat in my chest. Even muffled by the door, I recognized that voice. Older, weathered by experience, yet still carrying the same cadence and fiery tone that had characterized my brother's speech. Samuel. It had to be. Instinctively, I moved toward the inner door, drawn by that voice as if magnetized. Rachel caught my arm, fear flickering in her eyes, but I gently shook her off. "I have to see," I whispered. "I have to know." The door had a small, diamond-shaped window at eye level. The glass was fogged with age, but still transparent enough to reveal the sanctuary beyond. I looked through it cautiously, mindful of any chance of being seen inside. The church's interior was lit by dozens of flickering candles, their flames casting shifting shadows on the worn pews and the simple altar at the front. Before that altar stood two men facing each other, the space between thick with tension. One was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the cult's usual dark attire, with a beard streaked with gray. He carried the aura of a man used to commanding. I guessed him to be Elder Samuel, Jeremiah's second after Gabriel, a devout believer known for his strict interpretation of the cult's doctrine. Facing him, with his back partly turned toward Ethan's vantage point, was a slimmer man with fair hair, gesturing passionately as he spoke. Even from behind, even after 8 years believed dead, there was no mistaking him. Samuel was alive. My vision blurred with emotion, a wave so powerful I had to brace myself against the doorframe. My brother was alive. This revelation transformed my entire universe, reshaping everything I believed about the past 8 years, about my own guilt and perceived failure. It couldn't go on like this, Samuel was saying, his voice clearer now that I was closer. The child is innocent. Her mother, too. This has gone too far, Marcus. The elder spat contemptuously. The child is the seventh chosen, the vessel of prophecy. Her preparation is divine will. He waved dismissively at the woman, calling her a necessary sacrifice. You knew this. You agreed to this when you took your post as Gabriel. I didn't agree to kill children or burn families, Samuel retorted. The cult was meant to bring salvation, not death. My laugh was cold and bitter. The cult has always dealt in death, brother. You just refuse to see it. How many purifications have you watched? How many ascensions have you blessed? I challenged, my hands gesturing emphatically. Your hands are as bloody as ours. I saw Samuel flinch visibly, shoulders tensing as if struck. Yes, he admitted quietly, voice hollow. I've sinned badly, but it ends tonight. I sneered. Because of your long-lost brother, Samuel. The doctor who abandoned you to Jeremiah's mercy all those years ago. who let you die without trying to find the truth. Ethan believed what everyone was supposed to believe, that Samuel had died in that fire. I countered, that I died. That's what I wanted them to think. It was safer for everyone. As I absorbed this, I realized Samuel had been protecting me all along, maintaining the fiction of his death and hiding his true survival, even as I mourned, blamed myself, and bore that weight for 8 years. And now, I demanded, now that my brother is sheltering the chosen one, now that Jeremiah will stop at nothing to claim what's his by divine right, where do your loyalties lie? I stepped up with quiet resolve. My name is Samuel Carter, he said firmly. And my loyalty has always been to the truth. I reached inside my coat and pulled out what looked like the journal I had discovered in the antechamber. Records written in my own hand, detailing every death, deception, and penny extorted from desperate souls seeking salvation. Samuel's face darkened with rage. Give me that, I snapped, stepping forward. Jeremiah entrusted those records to me, not to some traitorous apostate. William simply tucked the journal back inside his coat. No, it's evidence for the federal authorities in Denver now. Samuel roared in fury and lunged at William, hands reaching for his throat. The two men clashed, grappling across the altar space. My greater size gave me an advantage as I drove William backward over the sacred table. He fought desperately, but his strength wasn't enough against my enraged elder. Samuel's hands closed around William's throat, thumbs pressing aggressively inward. Ethan didn't recall moving, didn't remember drawing his pistol or smashing through the sanctuary door. He was just there, weapon aimed at my head, echoing a clear command. Let him go now. I froze, turning my head slowly in recognition, eyes widening before narrowing with contempt. I tried to access the service, but it was down or not responding to traffic from Cloudflared. I received a 502 bad gateway error indicating that I was unable to reach the origin service. The service may be down or not responding to traffic from Cloudflared. As we prepared to leave, I found myself standing beside my brother, both of us watching the waterfall that had hidden us throughout the night. I never stopped searching for you, I said softly. Not face to face, maybe, but in my heart. Every day for 8 years. Samuel's smile was tinged with sadness, but was sincere. I understand. I saw you occasionally from afar. I watched as you built your farm, living your solitary life. He paused. I wanted to reveal myself countless times, but I knew it would put you in danger. It would have compromised everything I was working to protect. I understand, I reassured him, and I truly did. It was about strategy, not emotion, despite the emotional toll. But now we will see this through, just as it should have been 8 years ago. Samuel nodded, his features hardening with resolve. We agreed. No more secrets, no more separate ways. As the sun broke over the eastern hills, we set out, 4 figures moving determinedly through the wilderness. A man who had lost his way and rediscovered it through an unexpected purpose. A brother returned from a living death. A mother who had summoned the courage to fight for her child's future. And a little girl whose quiet insight had united us all in this timeless place. Behind us, the waterfall kept its endless descent, water cascading over stones in a cycle of renewal. Ahead of us lay Silverbrook and Reverend Malachi, and the final reckoning that would determine everything. The ultimate confrontation was imminent. The truth was about to be uncovered, and the church, whether real or symbolic, would burn, consuming not lives but lies, cleansing through revelation, not destruction. The fire of redemption had already been ignited. Nothing could put it out.